I'm Alex Mozet, and we're here on Winner Take All. I'm also joined by Nick Johnson, co-author of the book Modern Monopolies, along with myself. And today we're going to talk about B2B chemical distributors and B2B chemical marketplaces and what's going on in this space. So, Nick, you've done a lot of research on this. How would you tee it up? Where would you start with this?
Yeah, I think that what you're starting to see today, we've talked before about the failure of B2B marketplaces in the 90s and 2000s and why that happened and why that's changed. And what you're seeing today is this is really a second wave of B2B marketplaces. You had a lot of these failed chemicals marketplaces back then. Today, you're actually seeing a lot of these come out and starting to look successful. And the interesting thing is a lot of them are actually coming out of incumbent distributors. So you have, Commandis, 1-2 Chem, Go Buy Chem. Those are all from large chemical manufacturers and distributors in Europe that have essentially said, we're going to go create our own B2B marketplace, allowing third-party sellers. You also have, I think, Covestro is trying out something they call, I think, Covestro Select, which is basically their version of let's go create a marketplace. These are all big chemical distribution and chemical producers, and they're actually embracing this marketplace model at a very early stage. A lot of this stuff is still very early on. None of them have major traction. But you're also then on the flip side seeing startups get into the game. There's a startup called Pinpools in Europe. There's another one that's looking more at the supply chain called ChemSquare. There's a number of these B2B marketplace startups. In the US, there's one called Node. And then you're seeing these actually emerge successfully compared to what happened in the past, which is you had, Ariba, Alemica, and then ChemPoint, which were the ones that ended up shifting away from B2B marketplaces to more like things like ERP software and seller services. So those are the ones from the 2000s that survived basically by not being marketplaces and shifting more towards software and services. The ones you're seeing today are actually true marketplaces, and it's pretty remarkable that they're actually getting some traction.
And I mean, the key thing for any marketplace, particularly a B2B marketplace, to get traction is if there's a lot of fragmentation.
Right.
And so I think, for a typical outsider that maybe doesn't know a lot about chemical distribution, outsider looking in on the industry, you kind of think about it and say, well, I don't really know if there's that much fragmentation in the chemical manufacturing and distribution space. But is there enough fragmentation there for a marketplace to really get root?
Yeah, I'd say particularly on the distribution side, if you look at the top end of the spectrum, there's some concentration there. I think in the US, the top handful of companies have about 40%. In Europe, I think the top 5 or so companies have about 35% market share in those industries. And there's been increasing concentration if you look back over the last 10 years, as has been the case in many B2B industries. But there's also thousands and thousands of mom and pop distributors. I think there's 20 plus thousand, tens of thousands, certainly, of chemical distributors in Europe alone. And a lot of these are small, mid-sized players that have a particular regional kind of area that they serve. These are exactly the kind of buyers that would be well served and excited by a potential marketplace emerging.
And I mean, usually where you see challenges or opportunities for marketplace to start. One challenge would be if you have just plain and simple, a lot of heavier products, which means that it's much harder for the distribution and fulfillment to be centralized. It's a much more regional model, right? That would be one dynamic. The other dynamic to take into account is how commoditized are the products or how specialized are the products. And, I think in chemical, we're kind of seeing an interesting mixture of both of those factors, kind of that heaviness, that distribution dynamic, and that commoditization dynamic. How would you break that down as to where a B2B marketplace would really start?
Yeah, I think in chemicals, the interesting thing, like a lot of other B2B industries, there's a lot of spot buy activity, particularly on the smaller side of the market. There's still obviously a lot of big contract business. That's not where the marketplaces are going to play, certainly not at the start. In chemicals, you have a lot of commodity type chemicals, but even in the specialized industry where to typically say, oh, there's a lot more of a value-added services component, still a fair amount of specialty chemicals. It's, we put it in a bag and it sits in a tank. It's not really requiring a lot of extra mixing or expertise to that customer. A lot of it is kind of simple stockholding activity. And that's the kind of stuff that these marketplaces are going to excel at. And I think the distribution companies and chemical producers, they know this and they see this. That's why you've started to see over really just the last couple of years, a lot of these marketplace initiatives start to emerge because there's a big opportunity here.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other thing, obviously, I mean, there's contract customers, there's spot buy customers. Obviously, the spot buy is definitely much more vulnerable than the contract. Those are typically also going to align with smaller customers that have less of a need for high touch or value add services as a part of that transaction. So you're looking at spot, you're looking at small, medium sized customers, at least in the beginning, as to where a B2B marketplace could get traction. I mean, the other dynamic here is, you're transporting chemicals. Is the actual fulfillment and the logistics of doing that, and now you're kind of purchasing products that could have certain regulations that they need to comply with. Is that a non-starter? Is that a huge barrier to entry, or maybe not so much?
I mean, it is obviously a barrier to entry compared to things like B2C, which are much less regulated. But I think part of the reason you've seen a lot of this taking place in Europe is they do have a kind of fairly standardized regulatory regime governing the sort of sale and distribution of chemicals throughout the European bloc. So that gives you a pretty common market to be able to start up in, say, a particular country. There's a few of these, I think, that have started up in Germany, where they do have a lot of chemical production companies, but then starting to expand well beyond that into other regions. And then similarly in the US, you have chemical regulations that there might be some variations state by state, but you still have a pretty big market that you can start to roll this out to.
Mm-hmm. And so, what about the threat, right? I mean, obviously this business model is very disruptive and could pose as a direct competitor to the traditional linear distribution model that's been around for many, many decades. Amazon Business is at least a $10 billion GMV business, growing at 20% a month. Are the large tech B2B marketplace platforms specifically targeting chemicals, or are they even in chemicals at all? What does that look like?
Oh, yeah. You definitely have big platform companies playing in this space. Alibaba has a big marketplace in China called 1688.com. They have a number of those big chemical companies like a BASF and a Covestro and others that are actually selling on that in China. And they have a few other B2B marketplace competitors with some scale in China. I think one is called OK Chem, and there's another one that has some significant scale too. So those are kind of the big three in China. And you're starting to see Amazon dabbling in chemicals. So Amazon doesn't have a lot of scale yet in chemicals, but if you look particularly within the lab and scientific area on Amazon, they do have a lot of kind of pack and ship type smaller chemicals. And this is an area that they're actually starting to build some supply behind. That lab and scientific area is a big focus area for Amazon. And that seems to be the beachhead they're using to start getting chemicals into their marketplace. And I would only expect it to expand from there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. We know Amazon Business has a big focus on universities and labs and these kinds of things. So obviously, if you can build supply in that arena, pack and ship, much more kind of relatively more commoditized types of products, not hampered by heavy or much more regional logistical factors for the kind of bulk of chemical distribution. But you can start to get a foothold there. You can start to get some buyers that might also actually want to purchase the literal chemical shipments in the future. And that gives you a nice foothold to expand into those other product categories after you have that demand base there.
Given how many of these relatively commoditized products there are in chemicals, I certainly wouldn't bet against Amazon getting into this space in a big way in the next few years.